The stainless steel outer casing of the Zeiss surgical microscope resting in the corner of the trauma bay was misaligned by approximately 1/16 of an inch. I noticed the visual discrepancy immediately because my entire neurological system is fundamentally wired to identify microscopic mechanical anomalies. I am a master horologist. I spend 12 hours a day seated at a heavy oak workbench, utilizing a 10-power jeweler's loop to assemble mechanical watch escapements, where the operational tolerances are measured in hundredths of a millimeter. A misaligned casing on a multi-million-dollar optical instrument is, to my eyes, a glaring structural failure. I was currently sitting on the edge of a rigid examination bed in the outpatient surgical wing of Vanguard Municipal Hospital. My left forearm rested flat on a sterile blue surgical drape. 30 minutes prior, a heavily tensioned mainspring inside an antique pocket watch had violently snapped in my workshop, sending a shard of hardened carbon steel through my protective sleeve and deep into my extensor muscle. Dr. Renata Rivera was currently extracting the shard and repairing the laceration. She was 39 years old, the chief of neurosurgery, and currently covering a critical staffing shortage in the outpatient trauma clinic. She operated with a terrifying, beautiful efficiency. Her hands moved in sharp, decisive, highly calculated arcs. In her domain, the variables were dictated entirely by tensile tissue strength, vascular pressure, and the strict laws of human anatomy. Flesh does not lie. It does not manipulate data. It either bears the load of the synthetic suture, or it predictably tears under the strain. I watched her work with deep professional respect. She pulled the final 4-0 nylon suture tight, tying the knot with precise, automated fluency. She glanced up at the digital vitals monitor mounted to the wall, then looked down at my arm. "You definitively declined the localized lidocaine injection during intake," Dr. Rivera noted, her voice a sharp, professional cadence devoid of unnecessary small talk. "The extraction of that steel fragment required significant probing of the muscle tissue. Yet your heart rate has maintained a baseline of exactly 62 beats per minute for the entire procedure, and your extensor muscles have not exhibited a single microtremor." "I require total neuromuscular control for my profession," I replied, maintaining a flat, factual tone. "Lidocaine induces lingering neuropathy and localized numbness that takes hours to fully dissipate. I cannot afford the loss of tactile feedback today. I simply compartmentalized the pain response." She stopped wiping the surgical field with the sterile gauze. Her dark eyes locked onto mine, rapidly analyzing the data. "What is your profession, Mr. Peterson?" "I am a horologist," I stated. "I manufacture, diagnose, and restore microscopic mechanical complications." Dr. Rivera stared at me for 3 long seconds. The clinical mask she wore fractured slightly, revealing a flash of profound, desperate calculation. She reached into the pocket of her white lab coat and pulled out a heavy, intricately machined titanium fountain pen. The barrel was partially unscrewed. The internal retraction mechanism visibly jammed and unyielding. My surgeon said, "I need steady hands." She set the jammed pen heavily on the sterile metal tray next to my sutured arm. She asked me to demonstrate. I did not ask questions. I do not require emotional context to fix a broken mechanism. I picked up the pen with my uninjured right hand. I analyzed the jam. The internal torsion spring had slipped past the primary retaining collar, locking the threads. I placed my left thumb, ignoring the fresh sutures against the barrel, applied a highly specific lateral micropressure to depress the spring, and rotated the cap precisely 3 degrees counterclockwise. The spring snapped back into alignment with a satisfying, sharp metallic click. The pen was fully functional. I set it back on the tray. It took exactly 4 seconds. Renata let out a long, slow breath. The severe tension in her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. "The digital intake file indicated you operate a private horology firm in the industrial district." "Correct. Precision Mechanics LLC." I confirmed, observing her shifting posture. "Are you available for an immediate, highly classified mechanical consultation?" she asked, her voice dropping to a low, localized whisper, ensuring the acoustic data did not carry beyond the privacy curtain. "I require an independent technical audit of a failing system. I do not service or calibrate medical equipment," I clarified immediately, establishing my boundaries. "The legal liability parameters are far too extensive. It is not a medical repair. It is a forensic evaluation of a mechanical system," she countered, stepping closer to the examination bed. 3 days ago, The primary articulating arm of the Zeiss surgical microscope in operating room 4 ceased functioning. The internal planetary gears locked mid-procedure. The hospital's exclusive equipment vendor, Richard Vance, performed a diagnostic evaluation yesterday. He formally concluded that the machine was damaged due to operator negligence. He documented that I manually forced the optical housing past its mechanical stop point, irreparably stripping the internal brass gears. I processed the variables. If you are a chief neurosurgeon, you inherently possess extreme fine motor control. The probability of you utilizing brute force on a delicate optical instrument during a procedure is statistically near zero. I know that, she said, her jaw tightening with suppressed frustration. But Vance holds the vendor monopoly for this entire hospital network. He is utilizing this fabricated negligence claim to leverage a massive administrative threat. He informed the hospital board that replacing the damaged housing will cost $200,000. He offered to waive the fee entirely, but only if the hospital signs a 10-year, exclusive, highly inflated supply contract with his specific distribution firm. Extortion via mechanical sabotage, I analyzed, seeing the pattern instantly. And if the board refuses to sign his contract, he submits his official diagnostic report directly to the state medical board, Renata whispered, the raw vulnerability bleeding through her professional armor. A formal citation for gross negligence and destruction of life-saving property will trigger an automatic, immediate suspension of my surgical license. The board votes on his contract proposal this Friday at 1,700 hours. He has cornered me in a bureaucratic trap. I cannot prove he is lying because his technicians completely control the diagnostic data. I looked at the misaligned Zeiss scope in the corner of the trauma room. I looked at the dark, exhausted circles under her eyes. She was a brilliant biological mechanic trapped by a corrupt corporate system. She was operating entirely without support. You require a master of micromechanics to dismantle the gear housing, locate the true root cause of the failure, and establish a verifiable chain of custody proving external sabotage, I stated, cleanly defining the operational parameters. Yes, she breathed, searching my face for any sign of hesitation. Can you do it? I charge a standard forensic auditing fee of $300 an hour, I replied, carefully rolling my shirt sleeve down over the fresh bandages. When is operating room 4 vacant? At 2,100 hours tonight, she said. I will meet you at the staff entrance, I confirmed, stepping off the bed. I will bring the necessary tools. At 2,055 hours, I walked through the sliding glass doors of the employee entrance. I wore clean, dark, civilian clothing. I carried a heavy, hard-shell Pelican case containing my specialized diagnostic tools. Renata was waiting in the sterile corridor. She wore fresh green scrubs, a surgical cap, and a lanyard holding her heavy collection of keycards. The janitorial staff has cleared the floor, she informed me, leading the way down the long, brightly lit hallway. We have a 2-hour operational window before the night shift charge nurse conducts her rounds. We entered operating room 4. The space was entirely dark save for the emergency exit lights. Renata bypassed the main overhead switches, utilizing a small, localized surgical spotlight to illuminate the center of the room. The massive, articulated surgical microscope hung suspended from the ceiling mount, a highly complex monolith of steel, glass, and precision motors. I set my Pelican case on a stainless steel surgical prep table. I popped the latches. I need quiet, I instructed, pulling a high-powered, articulated LED headlamp over my forehead, and I need you to hold the secondary optical housing to prevent gravity from stressing the internal cables when I disengage the primary locking collar. Renata stepped forward, placing her hands exactly where I directed. Her grip was completely firm. She did not tremble. I selected a specialized micro-Torx driver from my kit. I began systematically dismantling the outer casing of the articulating arm. The tolerances on the German-engineered machine were tight. I moved with slow, deliberate precision, logging the exact placement of every microscopic screw on a magnetic tray. After 20 minutes of intense, unbroken focus, I removed the heavy steel cover plate, exposing the internal planetary gear system that controlled the machine's primary pivot. I leaned in, activating my headlamp to its maximum lumen output. I pulled a jeweler's loop from my pocket and wedged it securely into my right eye socket. I magnified my vision by a factor of 10. The primary drive gear is indeed sheared, I noted aloud, my voice a quiet rumble in the cavernous room. 3 consecutive teeth are missing from the brass ring. Vance's documentation regarding the physical damage is accurate. Then how do we prove I didn't cause it? Renata asked, her voice tight with impending defeat. By analyzing the fracture pattern, I explained, leaning closer until my face was inches from the mechanism. If you had manually forced the arm past its mechanical limit, the brass teeth would have sheared off cleanly in the direction of the rotational torque. The metal would display stretching and lateral deformation. I pulled a pair of ultra-fine, titanium Dumont tweezers from my kit. I carefully reached into the housing and extracted one of the broken brass teeth resting in the synthetic grease at the bottom of the casing. I held it up under the intense beam of the surgical spotlight. "Look at the base of the fracture," I instructed, gesturing for her to lean in. She leaned close, her shoulder brushing against my arm. The scent of chlorhexidine and clean linen immediately registered in my sensory processing. "It looks jagged." "It is scored," I corrected, utilizing my tweezers to point out a microscopic, unnatural indentation on the brass. There is a distinct, V-shaped groove cut directly into the root of the gear tooth. This was not caused by rotational torque. This gear was intentionally scored with a hardened steel microfile to create a severe stress riser. When you engage the motor during your surgery, the normal operational torque caused the weakened tooth to snap entirely off, which then jammed the subsequent gears. Renata stared at the tiny piece of metal in my tweezers. The realization of the malicious, premeditated sabotage hit her. He filed the gears. He purposefully destroyed a $2 million machine while a patient was on my table just to force a contract. He engineered a mechanical failure to harvest leverage, I agreed, dropping the broken tooth into a sterile glass vial. I am establishing a forensic chain of custody. I require high-resolution macro photography to document the scoring marks before we reassemble the housing. I spent the next 45 minutes utilizing a specialized digital microscope camera, taking dozens of detailed photographs of the internal sabotage. The data was empirical and mathematically sound. "We have the proof," Renata said, stepping back from the machine, rubbing her temples. "I can take these photos to the board on Friday. The photographs prove sabotage. They do not explicitly prove Vance committed the sabotage," I countered, removing my loop. "He will simply claim a rogue hospital technician caused the damage. He will deny liability. To neutralize the threat, we must restore the machine to functional capacity before the board meeting. We must remove his leverage." "How?" she asked, gesturing to the broken gear housing. "Vance controls the supply chain. He will not sell the hospital a replacement gear without the signed contract." "I do not require Vance's supply chain," I stated, packing my tools back into the Pelican case. "I am a horologist. I possess a precision micro-lathe and raw brass stock. I will reverse engineer the gear ratio, calculate the exact pitch and modulus, and manually fabricate a functional interim gear in my workshop." Renata stared at me in the dim light of the O. "You are going to custom machine a part for a surgical robot tonight?" "I am going to repair a broken system," I said, zipping my bag. "The clinic perimeter is no longer secure. We must relocate to my facility." We arrived at my industrial workshop at 2,300 hours. I unlocked the heavy steel bay doors, hitting the overhead floodlights. The massive space was clean, highly organized, and filled with the heavy scent of machine oil and cutting fluid. I walked directly to the back of the shop, where my pristine, Swiss-made Schablin watchmaker's lathe sat bolted to a heavy steel bench. Renata stood near the doorway, observing the environment. The contrast between her sterile, white hospital corridors and my dark, oil-stained industrial reality was stark. Yet the underlying requirement for precision was identical. "I need you to measure the exact diameter of the intact secondary gear using these digital calipers," I instructed, handing her the heavy steel instrument. "I must verify the rotational ratio before I cut the raw brass." She took the calipers. "You trust me to take the measurement? You are a neurosurgeon. You possess an unparalleled understanding of spatial relationships," I replied, placing a solid block of raw brass into the chuck of the lathe. "I trust your hands entirely." For the next 4 hours, we established a silent, highly efficient, operational loop. It was an intensely private form of collaboration. We were not exchanging emotional dialogue. We were dismantling a threat using sheer mechanical competence. I activated the lathe. The high-pitched whine of the motor filled the shop. I utilized a microscopic cutting bit, slowly, methodically shaving away ribbons of brass. turning the raw block into a perfectly dimensioned gear blank. Renata stood beside me, utilizing a secondary light to illuminate the cutting surface, calling out the micrometer measurements as I worked. At 0300 hours, I encountered a minor variable. I shut down the lathe to clear the brass shavings. I reached for my specialized gear-cutting hob. It was resting on the far side of the bench. Renata anticipated the movement. She picked up the hob and handed it to me. "Thank you," I said softly, accepting the tool. Our fingers brushed. The physical contact bypassed my logical filters. My heart rate, usually a steady 60 beats per minute, spiked instantly. I paused, looking down at our hands. I did not immediately pull away, but I recognized the boundary. "I am going to adjust my grip on the tool," I stated quietly, my voice a low rumble, ensuring I asked permission before altering the physical dynamic. "May I shift my hand?" Renata looked up at me, her dark eyes reflecting the harsh overhead lights. The exhausted armor she wore at the hospital had dissolved in the safety of my shop. "Yes," she whispered. I shifted my grip, my fingers wrapping gently over hers for a fraction of a second before taking the tool. The transfer of heat was clear. "Your heart rate is elevated, Matteo," she noted softly, her clinical observation skills never fully turning off. "It is a biological response to an unexpected shift," I admitted, my jaw tightening as I forced the words past the iron gates of my usual isolation. "I am unaccustomed to sharing this workspace. Am I a disruptive variable?" she asked, stepping a fraction of an inch closer, holding my gaze. "No," I replied, turning back to the lathe to hide the sudden protectiveness flaring in my chest. "You are an exceptionally capable woman. We must finish cutting the teeth." By 0600 hours on Thursday morning, the brass gear was complete. I matched the modulus using the intact gear, I explained, holding the new brass component up to the light. I measured the factory backlash and verified the runout on the lathe. It is a functional interim component. It will restore full articulation for a board demonstration today. The OEM part from the manufacturer must still be ordered for long-term clinical use. But this removes his immediate leverage. At 1,000 hours, the operational timeline forcefully, violently accelerated. I was at my workbench, running the final ultrasonic cleaning cycle on the new gear, when Renata's phone vibrated aggressively on the table. She answered it on speakerphone while she wiped down the calipers. "Dr. Rivera," the frantic voice of a hospital administrator echoed from the speaker. "You need to get to OR 4 right now." Richard Vance just walked onto the floor with the chief of surgery and the hospital's legal counsel. They are conducting a surprise, unannounced equipment audit. Vance is demanding they visually inspect the broken microscope immediately. The situation had transitioned from a bureaucratic dispute to a live operational failure. Vance had moved his timeline up by 24 hours to catch her off guard. If they looked inside the machine and found the gear housing entirely dismantled and the parts missing, Renata would be fired on the spot for unauthorized tampering with medical property. Renata's face drained of color. She gripped the edge of the workbench, her knuckles turning white. The sudden invasion of her workspace triggered an immediate panic response. She backed away, her breathing becoming shallow and erratic. "We're 40 minutes away from the hospital," she stammered, the panic hijacking her logical processing. "They're at the door. I'm going to lose my license. I'm done." I reached forward and hit the kill switch on the ultrasonic cleaner. "Do not panic," I commanded, my voice dropping into a deep concussive rumble that commanded authority. "Panic is an inefficient processing error. It burns necessary oxygen. We will execute immediate triage." "How?" she cried, her hands trembling violently. "Vance is in the room." I picked up my phone and placed it face down on the workbench, giving her my undivided attention, ensuring she understood the gravity of my next statement. "I am a systems hunter. I anticipate hostile behavior," I stated, my eyes locked entirely onto hers, anchoring her to my certainty. Before we left the OR last night, I anticipated Vance might attempt an early verification of his sabotage. I reassembled the outer casing of the microscope and secured it with the primary locking screws. The machine appears entirely intact from the outside. Renata blinked, struggling to process the logistical bypass. "But the internal housing is empty. If he turns it on to demonstrate the jam, it will throw a catastrophic error code on the main screen. The administrators will know it's gutted. He cannot turn it on," I corrected, my posture rigid, refusing to waver. Because at 0500 hours this morning, I invoked a formal lockout, tag-out protocol with the hospital's facilities management. I utilized a secondary contractor badge. The machine is secured under an active, documented electrical maintenance ticket. The main breaker is pulled and physically sealed with a red safety tag. Vance cannot legally bypass a maintenance lockout to turn it on without triggering an immediate, massive OSHA violation. She looked at my face. She saw the absolute empirical certainty radiating from my posture. The defensive walls she had spent a lifetime building against corporate predators dissolved. She wasn't surrendering control. She was accepting a massive, impenetrable shield. "You locked out the power grid," she whispered, her voice fierce and suddenly determined. I instituted a documented legal delay. I corrected smoothly, picking up the pristine brass interim gear and placing it in a secure padded case. "We have bought ourselves a window. Call the administrator. Tell them you require the presence of internal compliance counsel before any vendor touches that machine. We are driving to the hospital. Friday, 1,650 hours." The emergency compliance hearing was held in the executive boardroom of Vanguard Municipal Hospital. The room was a massive, intimidating cavern of polished mahogany, leather, and soundproof glass. The chief of surgery sat at the head of the long table, flanked by two senior hospital administrators and the internal compliance officer. Vance sat to their left. He wore a bespoke suit, projecting an aura of smug confidence. He assumed he had already won. He assumed the locked-out machine had merely delayed an inevitable surrender. The heavy mahogany doors opened. I walked into the room first. I wore my sharpest, darkest suit. My posture was perfectly rigid, my face an expressionless, immovable mask. Renata walked one step behind my right shoulder. She wore her white clinical lab coat. Her spine was perfectly straight. Her chin was up. The exhaustion was entirely replaced by a cold, radiant fury. Vance's confident sneer faltered slightly as we approached the table. "Dr. Rivera, I was under the impression you were coming here to sign the vendor contract regarding your negligence. Why is this?" "I am not here to sign a contract," Renata stated, her voice echoing loudly against the glass walls, dominating the acoustic space. I did not sit down. I walked to the center of the table and placed my heavy leather briefcase down with a sharp click. "I am here as Dr. Rivera's formally retained technical auditor," I announced, projecting my voice to ensure every person in the room heard the reality of the situation. "I am here to submit a finalized forensic report regarding severe mechanical extortion." The chief of surgery frowned, leaning forward. "Mr. Peterson, you are a horologist. You do not have the authorization to audit hospital equipment. I was formally retained by the hospital's internal compliance council at 0800 hours this morning. As an independent auditor," I replied smoothly, popping the brass latches on my briefcase. "I have uncovered an active, highly coordinated scheme to artificially manipulate diagnostic data for the purpose of illicit corporate blackmail." I pulled a thick, bound dossier from the briefcase. I did not hand it to Vance. I slid it aggressively down the length of the table, directly into the hands of the chief of surgery. "Document 1, I dictated, maintaining dead-eyed contact with Vance, "is a notarized chain of custody affidavit, complete with high-resolution macro photography. It proves that the planetary gears inside OR4's microscope did not fail due to operational stress. They were intentionally scored and weakened using a hardened steel microfile. It was an act of deliberate, premeditated sabotage." Vance jumped up from his chair, his face flushing dark red. "That is a complete fabrication. The gears shattered because she forced the arm. I have the diagnostic logs." "You have logs from a broken machine?" Renata interjected, her voice ringing out with undeniable clarity. "You engineered the failure to extort a $200,000 contract from this hospital? You can't prove I touched those gears," Vance shouted, stepping back from the table, his hands shaking violently as his primary leverage evaporated. "You dismantled the machine without my oversight. That violates the warranty. I'll sue you under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act for unauthorized access. The CFAA applies to digital network access, not mechanical gears," I corrected quietly, dismantling his legal threat with precise facts. "Document 2, I continued relentlessly, pulling a second sheet of paper from my briefcase and tossing it onto the table, "is a metadata trace of the hospital's electronic keycard access logs for operating room 4. It confirms that Richard Vance accessed that specific room alone At 0200 hours on Sunday morning, exactly 12 hours before the machine suffered its catastrophic failure, the administrators stared at the access logs. The data was completely solid. Why would Mr. Vance intentionally destroy our equipment? The chief of surgery asked, his face draining of color as the severity of the liability became apparent. Because he required a crisis to justify his inflated 10-year exclusive contract, I stated, staring directly into Vance's panicked eyes. You committed felony extortion, destruction of medical property, and severe breach of fiduciary duty. The penalty involves federal prosecution. Vance looked at the administrators. They were already pulling out their phones to notify the hospital's legal department. He realized his entire career had just evaporated. The machine is dead anyway, Vance hissed, a desperate final strike. You still can't operate tomorrow without my replacement parts. You need me. The machine's motion is fully restored, I corrected, projecting an aura of dominance. I manually fabricated a functional interim gear. The articulation arm functions smoothly with an acceptable factory backlash. The hospital does not require your parts, nor your services, to sustain operations, while the OEM replacement is shipped. The chief of surgery looked at Vance with sheer disgust. Security is on their way up, Richard. Do not leave the building. He turned to a board member. Cancel the Apex contract immediately. I closed my briefcase, the sharp click of the latches echoing in the room. The threat is contained, I announced softly. We walked out of the corporate boardroom and into the bright, crisp afternoon sunlight of the hospital courtyard. The chaotic noise of the city surrounded us, but the internal atmosphere was profoundly still. The massive weight of the extortion had evaporated. Renata stopped on the sidewalk, a few yards away from the entrance. She turned to face me. The defensive, exhausted armor she had worn for 3 days was gone. She looked radiant, powerful, and incredibly free. You dismantled him, she said. Her voice filled with quiet wonder. You walked into that room and took apart my worst nightmare using nothing but math and metal. He operated on a flawed psychological premise, I corrected, keeping my hands resting near the handle of my briefcase. He assumed you were isolated. He failed to account for an independent audit. He didn't know I had a master horologist in my corner, she smiled, stepping closer. The professional, clinical distance between us vanished entirely. She reached out. She didn't shake my hand. She slid her hand down my arm, her fingers intertwining securely with mine. It was a concrete action, a public claim made in the open daylight. I froze. The sensory input spiked. My heart rate elevated, a sudden, powerful rhythm drumming against my ribs. I didn't pull away. I allowed the connection to process. The board formally cleared my license, she noted, her voice dropping its professional edge, replacing it with a quiet loyalty. My surgical schedule resumes tomorrow. My operational requirements are met, I confirmed, my thumb lightly tracing the back of her knuckles. For the first time in years, my heart wasn't racing from the crushing pressure of microscopic focus or the fear of a mechanical failure. It was racing simply because of the presence of the person standing in front of me. Good, Renata said softly, her eyes locked onto mine with certainty. Because I still have a broken antique pocket watch sitting on my desk at home. I need someone who knows how to handle delicate mechanics. I am extremely rigorous, I warned her, the rigid walls of my isolation permanently dissolving under her touch. I prefer rigorous systems, she promised, squeezing my hand tightly. It requires a 2-person team. I looked down at our joined hands, feeling the heavy, cynical weight I had carried for years finally dissipate into the warm air. I didn't need a perfectly isolated system. I just needed one that was real. I will be at your apartment at 1900 hours, I replied. The end.